Nostra Aetate was a document which came out of the Second Vatican Council, which was commissioned initially by Pope John the 23rd. He didn't live to see the document promulgated, but it was signed by his successor, Pope Paul VI. And it was a complete transition, a paradigm shift in the way the Catholic Church thought about and taught about the Jewish people. It removed from Catholic teaching the idea that the Jews killed Jesus, the idea that the Jews had been replaced by a new covenant from which they were excluded because they wouldn't accept Jesus. It moved away from any attempt to convert Jews to Catholicism. It established a new and much more respectful relationship between the Catholic Church and the Jewish people. And then it was sort of a process. So that process became diplomatic relations with Israel, Pope John Paul II going to pray at the Western Wall, and very positive noises from popes and other Catholic leaders ever since.
So what lay behind this shift? I mean, obviously, for hundreds of years, at the heart of Catholicism was this idea that Jews had killed Jesus. We were all to blame. God hated us, and we were all going to hell. Why suddenly in 1965 do they completely reverse that policy?
I think it comes from the personal history of Pope John the 23rd. He was a Catholic diplomat in European capitals. He was involved in discussions with Jewish leaders in the cities where he lived and where he worked. He was also a very great-hearted man, deeply empathetic man. And also he'd seen ultimately where 2,000 years of anti-Jewish feeling had led, which was to the Holocaust. And he was determined to do his bit to make sure that his church made no more contribution to that sort of anti-Jewish feeling.
Now, interestingly, I remember a few years ago, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks wrote a thing where he suggested that all kind of religions were legitimate. And there was a lot of a great backlash to that, and he had to change something within one of his books. Whereas it seems to me that's what Vatican II effectively was doing. It was saying, the covenant between God and the Jewish people still exists, and Islam is a legitimate religion. How come when we tried to do that, or when Jonathan Sacks tried to do that, he couldn't get away with it, whereas the Catholic Church was prepared to accept that other religions or other faiths were just as legitimate as Christianity was?
I think there are multiple factors in why Vatican II and Nostra Aetate could make its statements and succeed at a certain level, whereas that didn't work for Rabbi Sacks in Dignity of Difference. First of all, you have a very hierarchical, top-down structure in the Catholic Church. And if a Vatican Council endorsed by the Pope makes a statement, it is unarguable, essentially. And people might complain or be unhappy, and I think many Catholics were unhappy. We think of Mel Gibson and his father and his family. There are people who reject Vatican II on multiple grounds, not just Nostra Aetate element. So there have been grumblers, but fundamentally, if a Vatican Council, a church council, and a pope sign on to something, then it becomes official policy, and there's very little way to argue with it. Whereas in the Jewish religion, the Jewish community, as we know, anybody can argue about anything, and they more than often do. So that explains that. But it's interesting that there were definitely concerns about Vatican II from Jewish sources at the time, because they worried this would be the result, that because the Catholic Church has said your religion is valid for you and it remains true, that the Jewish community would then be expected or feel pressured, encouraged to say the same thing about Catholicism or other non-Jewish religions. And that was a concern. We might be forced into religious positions that we were not comfortable with. Rabbi Sacks's attempt, or his framing of the question, I think was misunderstood at the time, partly because he didn't draft his book quite clearly enough. But he was saying what I think is we can all accept, which is if you are a Catholic, raised as a Catholic in the middle of Italy with no exposure to Judaism, or if you're a tribal religious follower in the middle of the Amazon, are we really saying that you have no relationship with God, that God doesn't speak to you in the way that your religion, your faith, your cultural beliefs teach you to be just and kind and merciful and to recognize a creator? Are we saying that there's no communication from God to those people? Are we saying that those people have no way of reaching out to God and touching divinity? That seems to me to be an unjust way of thinking about God and the world and God's creations. And I think that's what Rabbi Sachs was trying to elaborate upon.
Now, shifting to the implications of Nostra Aetate, presumably it led to a paradigm shift in interfaith relations and interfaith dialogue, which is something that you're very much into. What is the situation? I mean, what did it allow to happen that hadn't been happening in the past?
It allowed Jews and Catholics to meet in a non-threatening environment in which there was no suggestion or overtone or undertone that we were being looked down upon as lacking in covenant, lacking in revelation, lacking in truth. And so much warmer relations could be established between Jewish leaders and Catholic leaders and Jewish and Catholic laity and people on the ground. It took away suspicion and the idea, like, what's this person really thinking about my religious life? Are they really thinking I'm damned for eternity? That was always the difference between the Jewish view and some Christian views. The Jewish view is never that somebody who led a good life, who recognized God, would be excluded from heaven. We always believe that they would be welcome into heaven. We might quibble with their belief system. We might think they believe certain things which are inaccurate about God. But if they led a good life and they recognized there was a creator, they would make their way into heaven. Whereas previous to Vatican II, there was certainly the essential idea was if you rejected Jesus, you're going to go to hell, and that was a very heavy burden that sat on any pre-Vatican II Jewish Christian discussions, and actually it still hovers around discussions with churches outside the Catholic Church, because one wonders when one speaks to certain Protestant denominations for whom faith in Jesus is the be-all and end-all of salvation, you kind of wonder what they are thinking about your ultimate fate.
So can you tell us a bit about the Australian situation specifically? You're very involved in, as we said, in interfaith work here. What happens now between Jews and Catholics that wouldn't have happened 60 odd years ago?
There's a very extensive series of dialogues which take place regularly over the course of the year. For example, I'm seeing the Catholic bishops next week, and that's been a long-standing dialogue and relationship. It means there's very warm personal relationships. I attend the iftar dinner, which the Catholic Archbishop holds in Sydney every year, and I'm very honoured to be there. I sit at the Archbishop's table. He welcomes me as a colleague. He has spoken at the Great Synagogue to the Council of Christians and Jews in honour and memory of Rabbi Appel, who was a great proponent and activist in interfaith relations. So we have these exchanges. When I gave a lecture at the Great Synagogue for the Centre for History and Philosophy at Notre Dame University, which is a Catholic university, I gave a lecture on Jewish philosophy. The Archbishop attended. So it's not just a case of formal dialogue sessions. There's also great personal warmth and a desire to support each other's activities, which we regard as really very positive.
Did the aftermath of October the 7th impact at all on Jewish Catholic relations? Because I know a lot of interfaith dialogue suffered in that time. Did it remain strong over the last couple of years, or was there a dent in it at all?
There was definitely a dent. I think the Catholic Church did not know quite how to respond to October the 7th, and they were not deft in some of their responses, and that did cause, I think, a crisis in interfaith work initially after October the 7th, which has now been repaired through hard work on both sides. There was a meeting of the Catholic bishops, the Great Synagogue, and that was the first real coming together of a Jewish and Catholic leadership after October the 7th. It was several months or a year after October the 7th, and I was fairly forthright in the way I said that we had felt let down as a community by our Catholic friends. And I think some people were a little bit shocked by how firm I was, because generally speaking, I tried to be as warm and as gentle as possible in the way I talk. But I felt if we were going to be friends again and colleagues again, co-workers again, then that needed to be fully aired for there to be repair. And the Catholic bishops, I thought, accepted that with great grace. And it did clear the air, and we've moved on since.
And so, looking forwards, what do you see happening in the years ahead in terms of Catholic-Jewish relations?
I hope there'll be a continual building. I've always favoured something which hasn't happened yet, which is working on projects which we all agree are beneficial. This is also a Rabbi Sachs, and in fact a Rabbi Soloveitchik position, which is rather than talk about theology, where there can't really be progress. We believe what we believe, and you believe what you believe, and we're not going to pressure each other to change. If you want to change for your own reasons and purposes, then all power to your elbow. But it's inappropriate for a different religious group to try and pressure change. But we could work together on homelessness, on child poverty, on domestic violence. There are many social issues on which we all agree, and we would all concur would lead to improvement in Australian society, and we could work together to try and achieve those improvements. And that would be doing God's work in a way which would not in any way trespass on my or your theological beliefs.